Today, it's my thrill to invite Kim to introduce Kim Strassel. She doesn't need an introduction to many of you. She writes for the Wall Street Journal. She's a columnist for students who are here or watching online. I want to let you know you can get special student subscription rates to the Wall Street Journal. Just Google it and you'll find you can get it as a discounted rate. I encourage you to read it. Just in general, but for the editorial page and particularly Kim's columns. When I think of Kim, I think of the closest analogy I can think of is old Robert Novak, if you remember Bob, which is, I assume she'll take that as a compliment. Yes. Because Kim's not just one of these armchair opinion writers who sits back and pontificates. She actually does reporting. She talks to people. She digs into these big, deep reports that Congress does. And I look forward every Friday to her Potomac Watch column where she does this. She's also a member of the editorial page. She is a graduate of Princeton University. She went to work for the Wall Street Journal after that. And among her many, many journalistic and other accomplishments, in 2014, she won the Bradley Prize, if you're familiar with that, which is one of the most distinguished awards you can win for her journalism with the Wall Street Journal. And so today, it is my great pleasure to welcome all the way from Alaska let's give her a Boulder welcome to Kim Strassel.
You know, it's actually kind of funny on the germaneness question. People always say they want me and invite me to these things because they want to talk to me about politics. And as soon as they find out from Alaska, that's all they actually want to ask any questions about. You know, have you seen any moose? Have you ever been chased by a bear? Do you have running water? You know, things like that. So, so you can do that if you want to do that too. It is such a delight to be here at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization for the first time. I love that programs like this exist, and I just think it's amazing that they do. And I want to thank Todd, I want to thank Daniel and everyone else who got me here. I love the fact that there is actually a fellowship that Todd is occupying, the Visiting Scholar in Conservative Thought and Policy. It's so important to have that kind of debate and discussion. You know, it's funny, one of the things that makes me very sad about modern politics, and in particular people's views of editorial writers, is that a lot of people assume that we are all partisan. And that to me is so funny because I was attracted to work at the editorial page that I do and love working at the editorial page that I do for very different reasons. We do not exist to score points or to, you know, lambaste people or to pontificate. I was attracted to the page and came there because I really wanted to engage in civil debate and try to persuade people to some of the things that I really believe in deeply. You do not do that by calling people names or shutting up the other side. So I love that I'm speaking here at an outfit that is encouraging these kinds of discussions because it is one of the very foundations of the advancement of our Western civilization. So thank you all for having me. I would just like to devote this evening to having a discussion and trying to get a grasp of really where we are as a country right now. How does it compare to times past? And just as important, what does it mean for our political future? And by means of doing this, I just wanted to kick off with a little story. So I would wager that many of you in this room have what I like to call your first moment of political awareness, okay? And if you're a younger kid in this room, you might even have a more vivid memory of this because it might not have happened so long ago. And by that, I'm not talking about, by the way, I'm not talking about that moment where we all figured out what we believe in, right? Ideologically, where we decided that we were conservative or we were a libertarian or we were a Democrat, or the people that still completely continue to flummox me, all those people in 2016 who really couldn't decide if they wanted to vote for Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. I don't know what those people are, but there were many of them, and it was fascinating to me, okay? But no, when I'm talking about your first moment of political awareness, what I mean by that is that moment when you are a young child when you understand that there's this thing called politics. Because if you think about it, up until then, most kids, you just assume that your entire world, the entire world, is run by all the people and routines and institutions that are immediately around you, right? The world is run by your parents and your teachers and, the holiday schedule at Christmas and grandma's turkey dinner and your Girl Scout leader and your coach. And then suddenly one day you realize, to your complete shock, that in fact, all these relatives and institutions are not, in fact, the highest authority in the world. That there is this thing called politics, and that is made up of a place called Washington with people in it called presidents and senators and agencies called the IRS and the FBI. And that these people, in fact, not only call all the shots, but they have this incredible ability to drive all the adults in your life absolutely crazy. So my moment, and I'm about to break a cardinal rule here as a woman, I'm going to let you all know how old I am, those of you who can do math. So my moment came the summer I was turning 7. And I was sitting in the back of my mother's Buick Electra. So some older people might remember that car. This is a car that was so large, you could not only procreate a family in the back of it, you could have raised an entire family in the back of that car. And we're sitting there, and we're sitting in the back of a very long line because it was 1979. And not that I knew it back then, but we were in the middle of a massive oil shock, the aftermath of it, because of unrest in the Middle East. And Oregon, the state where I grew up, in its infinite wisdom, had come up with the odd even license plate day, thereby making the lines even longer. So we're sitting in this line, and we're not moving, and it's a very long line. And we're watching my mother, and all my memories of my mom, by the way, are very G-rated. She was like she is a pretty happy, upbeat sort of person. So we were getting a little alarmed. We were looking up at her, and we noticed that she's muttering to herself. And then she's doing more. She's turning this funny color up in the front of the car. Pretty soon she's like tapping on the steering wheel. Then she's banging on the dashboard, and then she's banging on the roof. And we're just about to flip out. We're trying to figure out like what we did wrong, because it was always us who did something wrong. And all of a sudden she just rolls down our window and starts screaming out the window this litany of unfamiliar words, all followed by the name Jimmy Carter. Blankety blank Jimmy Carter, blankety blank Jimmy Carter. And to my sister and my complete like shock and surprise, and we thought it was wonderful. We watched this gas attendant in alarm actually run in and lock himself into the gas station, which only caused everyone else to roll down their windows and start screaming at him, and people were honking their horns. And, we thought it was delightful. And what I didn't realize until more recently, what I'd actually been watching back then was like a 1970s version of Let's Go Brandon. And that day I learned 3 really important things: that my mom could curse like a longshoreman, that my grade school dictionary was missing a lot of really useful words, and that some dude who went by the name of Jimmy Carter was, according to my mother, the worst president in the history of the United States. And that's when I learned that there was something called politics. Now, look, Jimmy Carter wasn't the worst president in the history of the United States. But early on in Joe Biden's tenure, I was really, really struck by just how many people, in their need to try to make sense of the inflation and the high gas prices and other things that were going on in the country, decided that they were going to reach back to Jimmy Carter and to make that comparison. And how many people in those first couple of years of Joe Biden's presidency were all coming out and saying, Joe Biden is the worst president since Jimmy Carter. That was like their first thing that they thought of. And I started to think about it. And the more I started to think about it, the more I realized just how amazingly unfair that was to Jimmy Carter. We can laugh, but actually it's a really important point and something worth meditating on for a while, because it just doesn't do justice to the very grave differences between then and now, to the far greater risks that we are facing right now because of how we got where we did this time, and arguably the much bigger stakes if we don't change course pretty soon. Because it's just too easy and facile to say, well, we've had inflation before, before. We've had Middle East unrest before and high gas prices. You know, we've had high crime in this country before. We've had international setbacks and you know, sparred it up with OPEC. Because to take that view is to really misunderstand how we got here this time. It fails to note the big distinctions between the 1970s and the early 2020s. It fails to recognize that the miseries of the 1970s were very much rooted in ignorance and incompetence and a lack of adequate tools at the time. Whereas the miseries we've been experiencing in the recent years, by contrast, are miseries that were inflicted with purpose, with intent. They were purposeful. The people who have landed us here today with inflation and high gas prices and rising crime and global disorder knew what they were doing and did it anyway, knew what the outcome was going to be and did it anyway, and refused to stop even when the wheels started to come off. And that distinction is really, really crucial. So a couple of just super important differences between what many might reasonably call the two worst modern presidents ever. And look, don't get me wrong, Jimmy Carter was a really bad president, all right? He didn't have a clue. He was largely unsuited for the task at hand. He was a bit of a technocrat. He believed that you could kind of fix everything if you just pulled enough levers and dials in government and everything would come out in the wash okay. And he also vastly misread his mandate, right? A lot of people forget this, but Carter, very much like Biden, only barely won his election. Okay, and some people, all right, we won't even go there, okay? But, you know, in a nation that remained very, very divided after Watergate, he kind of barely squeaked through. And he campaigned as an honest politician. That was largely what got him over the finish line. And yet when he got in office, he decided he was going to try to reorient the whole wide swath of government. And then he got himself in a lot of trouble. But still, the comparison is just not fair. Because don't forget, and this is one crucial distinction, Jimmy Carter inherited most of his problems, most of his big problems. The 1970s was the decade of the Great Inflation, and it was happening all over the world. Every country in the world was experiencing this with very damaging economic consequences. Carter inherited inflation of 5%. He inherited unemployment of 7.4%. He also inherited a country that was already reeling from the first oil shock that we'd had in earlier 1970s, and was a country that was about to get hit with a second one in you know, issues that were somewhat well beyond his control. He also had a country that, by the way, had no domestic oil and gas industry to speak of. I mean, so he had nothing to work up to kind of deal with that threat. This was a globe that was still in the middle of the Cold War, with the threat of nuclear war still hanging out, tin pot dictators invading each other's countries all over the place, and satellite influence, and you know, those spheres of influence. And Carter also inherited a very high crime rate too, in a country that was still processing the trauma of Vietnam and Watergate. That's one big distinction. Second, and I think this is just as important, Carter had no guide for how to fix any of this, right? I mean, everybody, I was just saying, was making the same mistakes. You know, these days, many of us in this room understand the wonder and the brilliance of supply side economics, okay? We've read Milton Friedman, and while Milton was on the scene back then, nobody was really listening to him, not with any seriousness. We now know that if you create a giant supply demand imbalance, that you're going to get inflation. If you're pumping dollars into an economy, stoking demand, and at the same time putting crushing mandates on all the people that engage in supply, you are going to have a price imbalance in the end, and you're going to get the inflation that we've been seeing. But people didn't necessarily understand that back then. And that's why you saw country after country around the world throwing more money into their economy and then trying to mandate what prices could go by putting yet more government controls on it. And it was a repeat all over the world. You know, I have to be honest, I would actually like to think that Carter, because he was kind of a quirky guy in this way, I'd like to think that if he'd been presented the Laffer curve, he might have given it a go, you know? I mean, this was a guy, after all, at one point fired most of his cabinet and started over. So he wasn't afraid to take a different course. And that's the final all important difference. Jimmy Carter really did want things to get better. You know, This was a Democrat, by the way, but not like a lot of other liberals in his party at the time. Certainly not like the progressives of today's Democratic Party. For one, this guy was a fiscal conservative, okay? He continuously frustrated members of his own party by refusing to spend the levels of money they wanted to spend, vetoing their wasteful water projects. He had a good friend who once described him as tight as bark on a tree. Did you know that Jimmy Carter actually sold the presidential yacht? I did not actually even know that there was a presidential yacht until I did some research for this book. But yes, he thought it was frivolous that a president should have a yacht. He tried to sell Camp David. And he didn't get away with it because this is a guy, he was a Georgia peanut farmer, and you just didn't waste money. So, that was one thing. This is a guy, by the way, too, he liked businesses. He'd been a farmer. He'd been a small business owner. He wanted them to succeed. This is a guy who worked with Republicans to deregulate the airlines, the trucking sector, and the railway sector as well, too. A guy who, he might have worn a cardigan sweater around and preached conservation, but he did every possible thing he could to increase the supply of oil and gas and coal in this country because he wanted America to be energy independent. He belonged to a Democratic Party that, true, they did believe in government regulating consumer welfare and safety and environmental standards, but they also were a Democratic Party that, at least back then, actually really wanted the economy to work because they understood that when the economy worked, there were good headlines and you got reelected. It's a party that still believed in America being energy independent, and a party, shocking, whose members still believed they had an obligation to try to balance budgets. Okay. It's just mind blowing now, but you see where I'm going here, right? In terms of the comparison, why the comparison is simply so unfair and so deceptive because it gets to intent. Let's look at Biden by contrast. Okay. Biden inherited a fabulous situation in this country, including an economy with great fundamentals. And yes, you can say, oh, COVID. But the fact was that when he took office, the economy was just about to roar back to life. Okay, those vaccines were headed out the door, lockdowns were ending. Inflation, when Joe Biden took office, 1.4%. Oil and gas prices, almost at historical lows by a price adjusted basis. In no small part because America, 1 year prior to Joe Biden's inauguration, had become, for the first time in its history, a net oil exporter. First time in its history. Jimmy Carter would have killed for that situation. We had become a swing producer, which, by the way, is what finally gives a country an ability to affect international oil prices to some extent. He had a pretty stable global environment. And despite some summer of 2020 upheaval, George Floyd, the lockdowns, crime rates were still relatively low when he took office too. More importantly, this is really good, Biden took office knowing exactly what not to do. And you want to know why? Because he lived through the Jimmy Carter years. He was in the Senate when Jimmy Carter was president. He was the first senator to endorse Jimmy Carter for president. That's how long he's been there, by the way, folks. He'd seen, by the way, not just what went wrong under Jimmy Carter, but he'd seen the 1980s and the Reagan Revolution and how we got everything back under control and how you got an economy functioning again. So he'd seen all of it. And he'd also been warned in real time against pursuing that agenda that he initially laid out, namely his vast spending agenda, because everyone had seen the mistakes of the 1970s. Even liberal economists understood the risk of such a giant spending agenda coming on top of what had been 5 blowout COVID spending bills in the years prior, all right? Unless you are a modern monetary theorist, there are a few of those out there, more and more, everyone understands this basic rule about overspending and what you risk if you do it in terms of inflation. The New York Times in 2022 noted that in the early days of the Biden administration, a gathering took place of Treasury secretaries, past and present. One of those there was Larry Summers, who served in the Clinton administration, who not only expressed his alarm to the group there, but then went public again and again, warning publicly and repeatedly that inflation was going to get out of hand if this agenda was passed. Okay. Also among those in attendance, and I love this, was none other than W. Michael Blumenthal, Carter's Treasury Secretary, who explained that, quote, the basic problem that Biden faces is really not too dissimilar from the one that confronted Carter. And he urged Biden to abandon his sweeping spending in favor of deficit reduction. So that was the advice Biden was getting at the time in real time. And instead, Joe Biden, again with intent, he ignored all of this advice on spending, on domestic energy, on Afghanistan, and he created many of the situations that we are dealing with now, okay? In part because he has remained in hock to the demands of one side of his party. And, this was not a president who, a la Carter, didn't know how to handle the problems in front of him. This was a president who didn't have any problems and yet used these invented crises, COVID, climate, racial justice, and an ongoing ambition to radically restructure the entire basis of the American government experience, to create cradle to grave government. The White House and Congress used the excuse of COVID to pass trillions of unnecessary spending. We know this, we watched it, and pressured the Fed to keep rates low, creating the inflation we have right now, and continued to do it even as the klaxon bells were sounding, all right? The consumer price index rose 8.5% on an annualized basis in March 2022. And that was the fastest rate in 40 years, all right? And we had a number of economists who came out at the time and noted that that was actually deceptive because that was annualized over the last 12 months. And at the beginning of that 12 months, inflation rates have been much lower. So in reality, that March 2020 new number, we were probably running inflation at close to 15%, all right? And yet, did the administration stop? No, it doubled down on its ambition to get the Inflation Reduction Act across the line and the $300 billion in new chip spending that went out. And so we spent, close to another further $1 trillion after we saw those inflation reports coming in. To put this in perspective, by the way, I did a little math at one point, 2 years into the Biden administration. In 2019, the last year before COVID hit, the US government spent $4.4 trillion. All right. That was already too much because it was more than what we were taking in. Okay. During those 2 COVID years before Joe Biden came in, we spent about $6.4 billion a year. So half again as much as that number. All right. In the first 2 years of Joe Biden's administration, it proposed or enacted spending in excess of $22 trillion. 22 trillion, by the way, in addition to normal outlays, okay? And they didn't get all of it, thank God. But think about that number. And that was what they wanted to do the economy. And they'd have done it if they'd had the ability. I mean, if Joe Manchin had signed up for it, they'd have put it through. This is an administration that used a climate crisis to completely throttle what had become the most innovative energy sector in the world, once again, making us reliant on Middle Eastern dictators, mandating the use of products that nobody wants to use in this country. And again, all the warning signs were there about what was going to happen. Gas prices had started to rise in this country well before Vladimir Putin ever invaded Ukraine, well before. And it was in no small part because the administration on day one came in and sent a signal. It canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. Its moratorium on new offshore leases. It moved to stop pending leases like those up in Anwar, like those down that had already been administered in the Gulf Coast. They made it clear that they intended to squelch out fossil fuel production entirely. And the producers took the hint and stepped back. And yet, even as prices were rising, even as everyone understood what was going on, this administration continued to walk around and claim that this was Putin's price hike, and to double down again on policies that they knew were having a direct effect on people's ability to pay their heating bills and to fill their car up with gas. Even as the administration was flooding the economy with money, it also doubled down on Carter's mistake on the supply side, right? This is how you get inflation, the imbalance. For the past 3 years, corporate America has lived under the threat of new tax hikes. And not only is the administration vowing all those usual tax hikes against companies, whether that be corporate income taxes or capital gains taxes, it's actually working with OECD countries at the moment to institute a global minimum tax. so that if you don't like America's corporate tax rate, you can't go escape anywhere else. All the high tax countries are now trying to band together to make sure that we don't have any tax competition in the world anymore. It is also officially proposed in its budget a first ever wealth tax. All right, never happened before in the United States because everyone has kind of always understood it's like one of the dumbest tax you could ever enact. But that is one of the things that they've been proposing. What business person in their right mind now wants to plow any money into new ventures, expand their factories, take a new business risk? So even as, again, all this demand was building up with all those checks that were coming out from government, the supply side, the producers were like, we're kind of out. And sorry, you can't get your widgets, and sorry, you can't get your new cars, but we're just not going to invest anything under this environment. It's too big of a risk. So this is also an administration, by the way, that I think is putting even the former Democratic administration kind of to shame in terms of its regulatory onslaught. It's taking steps to shut down, as I noticed, all federal energy production, pipelines, fields. It's offered the smallest offshore leasing package in all of modern history. The Labor Department, the National Labor Relations Board are issuing rules to give unions a whip hand in all of their negotiations against employers and franchisers and independent contractors. Federal Communications Commission is gearing up for a war on private broadband suppliers. The Department of Justice's Antitrust Division is suing tech companies right and left, as is the Federal Trade Commission. And yet, and I think this is really important because it's another big distinction between what happened in the Carter years and now, there's one more thing that has also made all of this very concerning, and that is Jimmy Carter believed in the rule of law. All right. This administration is breaking new boundaries in terms of its casual dismissal of the rule of law, ripping down a lot of the standards and norms, flouting it, all in a quest for power, I would note. This happened a bit in the Obama years, whether it was, his DACA immigration order that clearly was something that had never happened before, whether it was their decision, I think on like 21 different occasions to just change the rules of Obamacare, even though they were supposed to go back through Congress, but that was too difficult. So they just kind of made it up as they went along. I think you can go back to that time and trace to it what we would call the quasi-weaponization back then of the Department of Justice, certainly against corporate America. But that is now child's play compared to what we are seeing coming out of this administration. This is an administration that daily issues orders and mandates that it knows are illegal because it's already been on the record saying that it knows that they are illegal. Eviction moratoriums, vaccination mandates, canceling student loans. The president came out and said, I don't have the authority to cancel student loans. And then he cancels all the student loans. And the Supreme Court, in their opinion, actually said, one of the reasons we're not going to let you do this is because, here's a little quote where you said you knew you couldn't do this. It was remarkable. Many of these orders, by the way, have come even after the president, as I noted, has gone on record acknowledging he lacks the power to do this. On his very first day in office, and I think this kind of set a tone for the administration, that Joe Biden fired the Trump-appointed general counsel to the National Labor Relations Board, breaking with all precedent, which held that general counsels could finish out their terms. Okay, and it was a sign of a hardball that they were going to play, just how aggressive they were going to be. Lena Khan, who's the current head of the Federal Trade Commission, not a lot of people know this, she's completely overthrown the commission's current structure, has stripped all power away from the neutral administrative law judge that in the past had always overseen fact-finding at that agency. Just because she didn't like some of the facts that he was finding. So she's put herself in charge now. By the way, some of these moves were so aggressive. Christine Wilson, who was one of the Republican commissioners, actually resigned in protest, saying that she could not in conscience continue to give legitimacy to a board that had no care whatsoever for the rule of law. We've got departments and bureaus that are no longer even bothering to go through that pesky thing called rulemaking. It's just too complicated. It takes too long. And then people can take you to the courts, and that's no fun. So instead, they just issue enforcement actions. They sue this or that agency, and in doing so, set the precedent. They might not have made a rule, but they let you know that if you engage in such behavior, you will be the next one who will be sued as well, too. All of this has been very, very bad for standards and norms in Washington. And we've also had, for the first time ever, and it's very, very disturbing, entire bureaucracies who've been unleashed on people who dissent or push back against any of this. We now know, thanks to Twitter and a federal judge, that this administration exerted relentless pressure on social media companies to silence anyone who pushed back on their COVID science or climate issues or a number of their other agendas. This is an administration that has had every intention, until there was an outcry, of creating a disinformation governance board at the Department of Homeland Security. By the way, my husband recently reread Animal Farm, and he was like, wow, like they're all reading this too. The Department of Justice, I mean, and I think this is very hard to say anything other, although I hate having to say it. It's very difficult not to argue that this is increasingly looking like a politicized weapon against political opponents. You know, there used to be a day not so long ago where the Department of Justice would do anything to try to avoid walking in to having to indict a political character because they were so worried that they would look politicized. That's all they do anymore. Okay. You know, and his statement, I cannot believe that I'm actually saying in this grand and glorious country, we currently have a Department of Justice that has indicted a former president who also happens to be the leading opponent to the current occupant of the White House. Can anyone say like Venezuela? Yes. That is what that sounds like. It's really, really disturbing. And I think people should just be very, 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 very upset by what's going on there. We also have, by the way, can we knock it off with the special counsels? I mean, we had a special counsel on Bob Mueller, then we had to have a special counsel to go clean up for that special counsel. We have a special counsel investigating the former president. And because of that, we now have a special counsel investigating the current president. We now have a special counsel investigating the president's son. You know, maybe someone at the Department of Justice could just go after like a mobster once in a while. And I just would like to note this too on the standards and norms front, that this quest for forever power is more disturbing at an even bigger level because of the things that haven't been obtained, but which people are now openly saying that they want. And again, it's quite stunning to actually say so. We now have nearly every Democratic senator on the record saying that if and when they have the votes, they will kill the legislative filibuster so they can impose an agenda with just 51 votes. We have now nearly every Democratic senator on the record in favor of altering the makeup of the Supreme Court, either packing it or term limiting those that they don't want to see on the court anymore, simply because they don't like the fact that they don't control it anymore. Not because there's dysfunction or a problem. I mean, this is just a naked power play. And we have, by the way, too, a significant majority of the Democratic Congress now in favor of outright getting rid of the Electoral College, stripping flyover states of their voice in elections. It should be majority rule. New York and California should tell everybody how to live.
Until Texas takes.
Well, until Texas grows, right? And Florida, until everyone moves to Texas and Florida, they might regret that, right? It doesn't really make, I mean, it does not make me happy to say any of this, by the way, because I am not some partisan just reveling and beating on the other side. Far from it. What concerns me, having watched Washington for 30 years, is that whenever, and I can just promise you, whenever one side lowers the bar, that bar never goes back up again. All right. So the next party is going to lower it further. You know, not so long ago, it was actually rare for Congress to hold a cabinet official in contempt. Then Nancy Pelosi Democrats blew up that standard, issuing contempt orders right and left. And guess what? Republicans are now gearing up to do the same. Okay. Not long ago, it was unheard of for a congressional party in power to strip a minority party member of their committee assignments. Okay. The last Democratic Congress set that standard. And guess what? One of the first things Republican did was throw Adam Schiff off the Intelligence Committee, which probably I actually agree with. You know, not so long ago, it was really rare to turn to impeachment. We had two under the prior presidency, and we already have a locomotive headed toward an impeachment hearing on Joe Biden as well, too, for stuff he did as vice president. And there's a whole constitutional question there, but whatever. Back to the point. All of this shows why the comparison is unfair and why it's so important to understand. The two different men instead provide an extraordinarily valuable contrast. Carter made mistakes, but Biden has pursued his agenda with purpose. And what makes it worse is it's been for the most cynical of reasons, politics. Okay. I mean, I do not fundamentally believe that Joe Biden believes in most of the things he's pushing. All right. I don't know if Joe Biden knows where he is sometimes. But Joe Biden, if you look back at the long sweep of his history and career in the Congress, he was always just kind of right in the middle of wherever his party was at the moment. And it's not like anyone, when he was running for office, was like, I believe in the Joe Biden agenda. What would that even be? Like, nobody knew, right? He instead, the center of gravity in the party has shifted to progressives and to the left, and they're now calling the shots. And that's why we're getting the policy that we're getting. And it's sort of frustrating because he's doing this to save his own political hide in a way. You know, he doesn't want the pushback and the blowback from most of his party. And so if you look out there, I mean, most Americans don't want this either, the agenda, but there's nobody in the White House currently stopping it. So this is what people who care about freedom, who care about functioning markets, who care about a good economy, this is what we have to be aware of. This is what we have to face. And I want to be clear, the United States is not in the worst shape it's ever been in the history of the country. Okay, we need to keep things in perspective. But I would argue that it is in the worst shape it's been in modern America. I would argue it's been as bad as anything any generation in this room has seen before. And that gets to next year in this election and what may be coming. You know, the most remarkable thing to me you see running through every poll right now is this bottom line. Joe Biden and Donald Trump are currently both on autopilot to seize the nominations for their party and engage in a rematch of 2020. And yet, the polls also show that despite that, literally nobody in America wants that to happen. It's fascinating, completely fascinating. And there's we could do a whole other lecture on what has gone wrong there, why we're in a situation like that. But I mean, just to bring this into focus, I mean, Joe Biden is, you know, running away with his nomination. And yet we recently had a Wall Street Journal poll, only 39% of voters hold a favorable view of the current president. That's probably overstated, by the way. His approval numbers on specific issues, the economy, 37%, inflation, 34%, the border, 30%, dealing with China, 34%. Put another way, 2/3 of the country reject Joe Biden's management of the issues that matter most to them right now. And 73% of people asked in that journal poll believe he's too old to run for president again. Okay, and by the way, like Donald Trump's numbers are like almost just as bad, if not worse. Okay, and yet they're both cruising to essentially a rematch of King Kong versus Godzilla. Yeah. It's just really scary. Nobody wants this. But by the way, what else is new? If you asked me my 30,000-foot view of what has been happening in this country over the past 20 years, I would say for the past 20 years, the American people have been standing and shouting at the top of your lungs, stop it to Washington. And that's why you keep seeing these shifts, right? It's why they put Democrats in charge and then they throw them out and put Republicans in charge and throw them out and put Democrats, because everybody keeps promising that they're going to be the next grown-ups in the room. And then nobody acts like the grown-ups in the room, okay? Most Americans, they want reasonable people who focus on government, who solve the big problems, who get stuff done, the things that matter to them. And yet year after year, and if you don't believe me, look at the clown car that was Washington this week, they get wilder and wilder politics that results in fewer and fewer solutions to those big problems. I mean, could anyone actually even imagine right now the thought of Congress coming together to deal with our Social Security problem? Could anyone even consider the possibility of that happening? Okay, and we laugh, but again, this is a pretty modern phenomenon. Look, yeah, it was back in the 90s, fair enough, but you know, Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress worked together to pass welfare reform, okay? George W. Bush, they got, not everybody loved it, but both sides came together, No Child Left Behind Act, a major piece of legislation that at least was a honest attempt. It might not have turned out the way everybody liked it, but is an honest attempt to try to deal with some real failings in the education sector in the country. Can anyone imagine that happening right now? It's impossible. The thing that's also amazing to me is that you can see this frustration playing out in electoral politics. We are seeing some major changes out there. If you just put your ear to the ground and watch and dig into some of the recent election changes we've had, like, look at what's happening out in the states, okay? In the places where people do feel that they have a little bit more ability to affect what's going on in politics. Look at Glenn Youngkin's victory in Virginia. Look at the parental revolts that are going on across the state. This last year has been the year of school choice. We just saw our 9th state pass school choice this year, universal school choice. It's astonishing. It may soon happen in Texas, maybe if they get shamed hard enough into it. Look at that. Look at the urban voters out there who are chucking out their mayors or recalling their progressive, prosecutors in their states because of problems that they're having with crime. Look at some of the minority voting patterns that we're seeing out there. I mean, there are some stunning changeabouts in districts, for instance, down on the Texas border in certain areas of Florida, where entire communities of Hispanics are no longer voting Democrat, they're voting Republican, but where there are also other shifts among other portions of the electorate away from Republicans. There's a lot going on out there, and it's all comes down to the frustration people feel. And that, to me, is the total mystery of today. The mystery is why no political party has yet figured this out. That there is a nation that is crying out for change, and the first party that figures this out, that is going to put forward a leader who is sane and sober and principled and optimistic, maybe somebody like a Reagan, inviting with a vision for people to come in and taste the water, feel the water and be part of a movement. Those people are going to inherit political riches, okay? People are dying for this to happen, which is what allows me to now round back this speech to Jimmy Carter's times. We had a moment like this in the past. In 1980, a former California governor named Ronald Reagan recognized the extraordinarily deep discontent in the country, the malaise brought on by decades of dysfunction, and then more recent Carter management. And with some wit and with some humor and with some principle and with some optimism, he didn't just win one landslide election, he won 2. And by the way, that second one, as some of you may remember, 49 states. 49 states. He only lost Minnesota. Go Walt Mondale. But the other thing he did, though, he didn't just win those 2 elections. He changed electoral politics in this country for a generation. I always like to laugh. People used to talk about, Reagan Democrats. We don't call them Reagan Democrats anymore. They're called the conservative base. All right. That's how profoundly Reagan changed politics in this country. I truly believe we are at a similar moment, different dynamics, different situation. We've obviously moved on in some regards. Carter and Biden are very different in many ways, but what they've both done is brought this country closer to a tipping point. And the question, I think, at this point is saying which way we tip and which party is smart enough to realize that opening that is there. So a couple differences between then and now. Thank you all for your time. And we can talk about anything you want as we go through Q&A. Thank you.
All right, great. I committed the fatal sin of a host, and I forgot to display the book.
Oh, it's okay.
That we've been talking about, the Biden Malaise. I just have 1 or 2 questions for you, Kim, before we throw it open to the audience for their questions. And this was a question that came in from the floor, so I forgot my laptop. There was one I was thinking also, which is you give the opinion that Biden's doing this for politics.
Yep.
Yet it seems like political suicide. It seems like
Agreed.
You know, he's getting 34% in that, that sort of thing. Is there some sort of 4D chess going on here where you deliberately adopt unpopular policies that they're going to help him get reelected?
I should have been more clear. He's doing this for internal party political reasons, meaning he doesn't want to revolt among his progressive left. And this is what they want. And, you know, I think he was seriously worried that they might throw him over, you know, revolt against him.
He might get primaried.
Primary, exactly. And so he decided that he was going to take the path of least resistance. I think it's been made easier by the fact that he is completely surrounded in the White House by members of Bernie Sanders like family and team. And some of them definitely more progressive members of the Obama administration as well too. So those are the whisperers that are telling him what to do. But I agree with you, it is political suicide. Look at those numbers. And by the way, I truly believe those numbers would be even worse. We're probably going to get into this, and you know, I'm always careful about like getting too much into candidates. Donald Trump is an incredibly polarizing figure, okay? Give him his due for the policies he put in place. Give him his due for giving the Republican Party, I think, the kick in the butt it needed back in 2016. I think it's a large reason he was elected. He's incredibly alienating at the moment, and I fundamentally believe that if he were not at the top of the ticket right now and all the focus was on some of the other top contenders, say a Ron DeSantis or a Nikki Haley, that in theoretical head-to-head matchups, Republicans would be beating Joe Biden by 10 points right now. Not a like close thing. You cannot have a 39% approval rating and end up with a head-to-head theoretical matchup that's close unless you've got an opponent that is equally odious to the nation as you are.
You mentioned Trump, and that was one of the things I was thinking. So I recall in 2016 of the 16 or so Republicans who ran for president, Trump was my 17th choice. And, you know, and it was because I didn't believe he was a conservative.
Sure.
It was as simple as that. And obviously he defied my expectations in office. But in retrospect, I concluded I was wrong, that Trump was probably the only, in my opinion, Trump, and you can tell me whether I was wrong about this, but I think Trump was the only one who could have won in 2016, the only one who could have broken the blue wall in the Midwest. And, you know, and so, you know, in the book, you lay out a template, sort of a Reagan template, that's sort of the anti-Trump template at some point. You also suggest that it's Trump's policies that made him popular and not his personality. But am I wrong about 2016? And if I'm not wrong, what do I draw from the fact that Trump actually pulled the rabbit out of the hat in 2016? And what might we learn from that?
Oh yeah, look, I actually agree with you. I do think that he gave a jolt to the party, and you know, I mean, look, the way he consolidated it in the end. This is a guy who went through most of the primary in 2016, never really had more than about 35% of the vote, but he got the party to rally around him, and then he brought in a lot of people that had felt neglected by the party. Okay, so I have always said, like, Donald Trump's legacy to the Republican Party was twofold. One, again, he gave that party the kick in the backside that it needed, okay? People wanted somebody who was going to stand up and fight on some issues, all right? And they felt as though they had a professional political class that when it came to all kinds of issues that the media decided were, you know, sensitive and we're going to beat them up about, that professional political class ran and hide. Whether it was the environment, you know, the climate issue, whether it was, well, a whole bunch of things. And whether immigration, you know, a number of things, trade, for instance, and they were sick of it. They wanted somebody who was going to stand up and throw a punch back. They wanted someone who said, I'm going to pull us out of the Paris Climate Treaty. Okay, I'm going to do this. So I think and by the way, he was very successful. Do you see a single person standing up on the Republican debate stage at the moment who isn't a fighter? I mean, maybe other than Asa Hutchinson.
Who's not on the debate stage.
But who didn't take that lesson, right? Who didn't understand that was something that needed to change. So he did that. He also, you know, I think his other legacy was some really great policy, you know, and the Supreme Court, which, by the way, has just been so important. But if you look, it's funny. a lot of people, they want the narrative of 2016 to be, well, Donald Trump won and his approval ratings were okay when he was in office because of his fight on the border and because of this. No, his numbers were great because of the Reagan policies he instrumented. People love the fact that unemployment was so low. They love the fact that inflation was low. They love the fact that their gas prices were low. They loved the fact that, you know, we weren't paying money to international organizations and part of the Paris Climate Treaty. People liked all that. It was a good environment. And so now you have this, in my mind, this extraordinary rewrite of what happened in 2016. Apparently, according to the Democrats and the media, and unfortunately, even to a number of Republicans who have bought into this, I call these guys the national conservatives. Apparently, what happened in 2016 is Donald Trump was bitter and angry, and he got all the bitter, angry people to vote. And now the bitter, angry, that's all the ultra MAGA Republicans. And so everybody needs to be bitter and angry. And, you know, we need to hate on corporations because they're bad and they have too many big profits. And has anyone listened to Marco Rubio speak recently? He's like the leader of this NatCom movie. And I can't tell the difference between him and Bernie Sanders, other than Bernie Sanders does it better. Okay, I mean, there's a whole little branch of the Republican movement at the moment that is like, we have to be super populist and angry. That's not why Donald Trump did well in office. And by the way, I think it's kind of funny. You know what? You want to know the other reason Donald Trump won in 2016? In his own way, he was an optimist. Make America great again. Okay, he didn't say America's past its prime, America sucks. He was like, some bad people have not had America's interests at their heart, and we want to make America everything it can be again. And people love that. And I think one of the unfortunate things this time around is probably for some decent reasons, he's a little bitter now. And his message is not very happy at the moment. So he's kind of become the person that Democrats claimed he was before, but that he wasn't. My view.
One more question, and then we'll pivot to the crime, because I know a lot of people are thinking about this. So if Joe Biden is playing 4D chess that I don't understand, Matt Gaetz must be playing 5D chess that I really don't understand. Your column last week was Tolstoy and Trump, and it was about sort of the problems within the Republican Party. That was before this past week. Do you have any reflections on that? And if your source of any,
How long do we have?
how do you think this plays out? How does this actually end?
So, I mean, I'm gonna write my column. You get a preview if you read my column.
There you go. Neat.
You know, the thing, I got up this morning and I read a news article that was in a very tortured manner, trying very hard to claim that this moment in which, you know, Kevin McCarthy had been deposed equaled some, you know, put it in some continuum, some vast history and electoral change. And there were lots of references to populism and the tea, like a 13-year culmination of this and that. And I just laughed because you want to know what you saw yesterday? It was just the latest example of 2-bit partisan hackery that you get in Washington all the time. And the thing that was amazing was that Matt Gaetz and this crew actually managed to convince a group of people that they were the noble ones. Okay, it was the most amazing spin I have ever seen, having been there and watched what happened the last 9 months. First of all, just to be clear, you know, if they're standing there, we're the only real conservatives, and, you know, we're the only ones that care about 12 spending bills getting passed, and how dare Kevin McCarthy not get them passed by September 30th, and how dare he goes to Democrats for votes. They engineered that situation so that he didn't have any other choice. You know what? The Republicans won in November and couldn't even organize themselves for 2 months because that crew wouldn't give Kevin McCarthy the votes to be the speaker. They ran Andy Biggs instead, who got a whole 10 votes on the first ballot. Okay. And, you know, he got 2 on the 14th ballot. But, you know, people don't know this. It takes a long time to elect committee heads and hire staff and get a plan and do what you're needing to do. You use those 2 months between when you win elections and when you go and come back in January and make it done. They weren't able to do any of that. So they had to spend the first 2 months they were there picking up the pieces from that delayed speaker fight. Okay, by the way, then we couldn't work on appropriations bills until Republicans had a budget and McCarthy had negotiated with the White House the top spending levels. They drugged that out for another 3 months. All right. And then so we finally get those levels at the end of May, and then they start the bills. And guess who blocked them all in committee? guess who made sure that they couldn't make it through the appropriates committee and the rules committee and blocked them from coming to the floor because they were mad because they didn't get everything they wanted. So when they turn around and go like, how dare you not pass? Well, who did it? And yet they turn around and, and one last thing I would just point out, it's frustrating to me just because I watch these clowns all the time and they get away with it. It's just stunning to me. Just noting, there was continuing resolution up for a vote last week in the House that had been authored by members of the House Freedom Caucus, okay? Chip Roy is not some progressive. I mean, that guy is as conservative as they come. He helped author this. It had further spending cuts. It had border security. It had a new commission to evaluate the debt, all right? And had they passed that, they could have taken it to the Senate, whatever the Senate had, and negotiated something better than the Senate was going to do and won a conservative policy victory. And guess who tanked it? Matt Gaetz and his friends. And so we got none of that. And then what was McCarthy going to do? He could let the government shut down and the Republicans can take all the blame for our military members not getting paid. The Biden administration is going to just make it as painful. There's lots of things you can do to shut down the government. Don't hurt. You think they were going to do that? No, I mean, literally Yellowstone was going to be closed like tomorrow, so that everyone's vacation plans were ruined. And pretty soon we'd be talking about the senior citizens who weren't getting their Social Security checks. There was no winning that. And so we'd already lost on a good CR. We would have lost further on the shutdown. He had no choice but to go to Democrats to get this done because these yahoos wouldn't do anything about it. And then they stand up there and pretend as though they are the only principled people in the party. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, walked out of that meeting and fundraised millions of dollars off of the wreckage they left behind. That's politics.
Well, we look forward to your call.
Sorry. Sorry how I really
Sorry,
feel.
how you really feel.
I like winning, policy victories. And it's very frustrating when people gabble on about their principles and throw any potential victory down the toilet.
That's what it sounds like to me. So we'll throw it up in the questions out. We'll go over here to.
So you said we could ask about Alaska, so I'm going to do that. But I'll try and make it germane as well. So I'm very much a pox on both of your parties kind of guy.
Sure.
And I wonder about your experience with instant runoff voting, which I believe has been tried in Alaska, and what your thoughts are on that with respect to federal politics.
Sure. If you want to hear me really excise, get me talking about ranked choice voting.
Well, I do.
I just lived through that show up there. Let me be very clear with everybody because this is all sold, this is good government, and this is a way to bring our people together and everything, just so that everyone understands what ranked choice voting is, okay? Ranked choice voting is getting rid of every notion you have ever had about winning an election, because the person with the most votes doesn't win the election, okay? The person that most people wanted do not win. Instead, it's this very complicated system where you get the politician that everybody can live with. I don't want people in politics that are just the lowest common denominator.
But we're going to get one that 2/3 of people cannot live with.
This is true, but I don't believe that has anything to do with our methods of our voting. I think it has to do with gerrymandering. It has to do with a party and primary and caucus system in which parties have no authority or control anymore to help decide who the candidates are, direct democracy, and you're just shutting out. It has to do with campaign finance laws, in my belief, that have also stripped authority for parties and instead made billionaires the people that matter the most in terms of elections and advertising, etc. There's a lot of structural problems that I think are contributing to the fact that we are going to get two people, maybe. I still don't believe that. I think there's a 50-50 chance we don't get either of them, okay?
So which structural elements would you prefer to throw out? Because I'll suggest that getting a majority candidate may in fact be the most effective structural element to throw out to resolve some of this tremendous polarity
Well-
that we're seeing.
Maybe, but let me just also just flip this on its head. So I live in the state of Alaska where 60% of people voted for Donald Trump, okay? It's a very Republican state. We just got a Democratic congresswoman that nobody wanted. And that's the way the system is rigged.
Can you explain, because I have a friend who lives in Idaho and his jurisdiction's about to adopt this. Why is this become a Democrat? What is your perception of why Democrats prefer these novel votings? Is there some partisan reason why they might be advantaged under this?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends on where it's used and how it's adopted. There are also different ways, by the way, too. So, you know, one thing that was kind of fundamentally problematic in Alaska's was that this was also paired with a jungle primary system as well, too, which kind of resulted in a mess. I think it's very notable that these are places are only being rolled out in certain places. You know, they're not necessarily, yes, there are some cities who have adopted ranked choice voting, but that's okay because everyone on the ballot is a Democrat, right? So it's not like you risk not having your party in office. Notably and interestingly, these ranked choice things in terms of states have only been introduced in red states by people who don't live in those red states. So you work it out, look at what happened in Alaska, and that might tell you something. Because if you have a lot of, you know, statewide candidates that are all from one party, they will all eliminate each other, and then you're left with the person that nobody really wanted.
Eric Olson.
So I think it's an interesting question in terms of structural institutional change that we get at some of these problems. And you said correctly that most people don't want the likely, although perhaps not certain pair that we're going to face in this election. And then you just concluded the discussion of Matt Gaetz by saying that's politics for you. But you've devoted your career to observing the political system and critiquing it or commending those few rare instances of good action. I'm thinking from a more personal level, why should I even engage? Why shouldn't I just spend time with my 2-year-old and pursuing my career and building things in the private sector? Because to me, the status quo that you're describing strikes me as so fundamentally rotten that it seems like the last rational thing for me to do would be to engage directly with this political system in this election at the cost of all the other better things I could be doing with my time.
Yeah, so I mean, fundamentally, my heart always says we all have a civic responsibility to engage, whether it you know, repels us or not. Because if we don't, if everyone's attitudes are obviously never going to get better. That being said, the question is, how much do you invest in? One of the things I always say to people, and it always makes me laugh, like how much, especially people who call themselves, you know, free market, free people conservatives, how much time they invest in Washington, D.C. and the issues of Washington, D.C. I mean, one of the most fundamental precepts of those who supposedly believe in free markets is federalism. And we should all be hoping that much more of what happens in our daily life happens at our state and local level. And I always say, like, please put the amount of time and effort you spend watching Fox News and railing about what's going on into attending your local school board meeting, your city council meeting. Like, find out who your House assembly member is and your state senator is, and get involved in those. And then, you know, start a movement too to start pushing to demand to move things back to the states. I mean, there's an incredible figure actually that I have in the book that Milton Friedman wrote about at one point. You know, if you went back to the 1930s, the average federal income tax level was about 5%. So, I mean, bracket and amount, versus state and local taxes, which tended to be closer to like 10 to 15%. Obviously, you know, now we have state and local taxes in some places that are 10 and 15%, and a federal government that takes another 45% of your, you know, your income. But, you know, that just goes to show you how much has changed. We have to fundamentally care about that. And I think that would also help fix things in Washington, because, you know, where's the bench come that gets in Washington? It comes from state governance. And the more you're invested in having good people that are doing things here, the more likely those good people go there.
We'll go here and then here. So, and now go over there.
So, thank you for your talk. And I didn't want to ask an Alaska question. but I feel like you have been chased by a bear, so if you haven't. But my main question was, your outline of the problem is largely, well, I mean, exclusively almost economic, right? And on that basis, you argue for a new Reagan over and against, the sort of candidate that might be preferred by the sort of populist and NACON types. But those people, I think, might respond and say, while there is an economic problem, there is a prevailing and larger cultural problem. And they might even point to sort of libertarian policies as accelerating the cultural problem. And so I just wanted to bring out maybe that side of your thinking and just ask, what might you respond to those sort of people who say, while this is an issue and we have to attend to it, there is also this larger cultural issue, and we need to have a candidate that's fiery and really on those. Somebody like DeSantis seems to be doing something.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think that you can't ignore cultural issues, right? I mean, I think it's kind of interesting, if you look back at Reagan, he didn't ignore cultural issues, but he didn't lead with them either. And he also talked about them in a different way. And this is what kind of worries me a little bit about some of the NatCons and the sort of people who are leading on the, woke, the anti-woke and, parental responsibility and the trans agenda and all of these sort of things. Not that we shouldn't all care, but their argument is that we not only need to engage and push back on the rhetoric, but we need new regulations and rules that stop this or stop that, and that we want federal government to intervene in this space in one way or the other. One of the great things about Reagan and why he managed to keep together those three legs of the stool, the defense hawks, the spending hawks, and the evangelical right, the religious right. And I always love this. Grover Norquist, who runs American for Tax Reform, he had a great description of it. He said that coalition was the Leave Us Alone coalition. Meaning, just get the hell out of our churches, get out of our schools, get out of our institutions, get out of our life, and let us and our communities make these decisions on our own. And so I think it's worth talking about this stuff. I don't think you can ignore it. But if you're going to go down the road of now deciding it's okay to use the federal government in lawmaking for your cultural purposes and impose your agenda on everybody else, you fundamentally are a small government conservative.
I was struck by your invocation on this point of the book about Mitch Daniels. And why that struck me was I ended up on the Acela from New York City to Washington during 2012 when the Republican primaries were going on. And I just happened to sit next to a former high-ranking Obama person who'd served during the first term. And I was talking about, you were talking about the primaries going on. I remember this was this one with, Mitt Romney, but it was like Santorum and Gingrich and was that Kane 777, right? It was like this, it was quite a collection of characters, let's put it that way. And he said, the only person we were worried about was Mitch Daniels. He said we can beat every one of these guys. Mitch Daniels is the only one that worried us, which I thought was very intriguing.
He was a masterful politician. Very good. By the way, just to tell you, I have seen a lot of bears in the wild in Alaska. And I will tell you just a funny story. So a couple of years ago, my husband wanted to know if I wanted to go, and you get in an airplane, you fly over the Gulf of Alaska to this national park, Lake Clark, and you can bear view, and you watch these bears, and they get really close to you, they come right up, because they're not scared of humans, because they've never been hunted there. You get all these rules like don't eat tuna fish the day before, and wash all your clothes and everything. And then and my husband had been like, you sure you really want to go do this? I was like, I am so tough, of course, I'm going to do this. And so you get there and they have all these rules, right? You're like, the first thing you never do is run. Okay, never run, because you're just like a friendly thing. But the minute you run, you suddenly look like food, because only food runs away from bears. So you never run away from a bear. And then the other thing is like we were told we were all gonna sit down low, so they'll get closer, and you could really get a good look. And then if they got too close, the guide was going to tell us to stand up and make ourselves big, right? So there's a video of this, and there's one lady who you can hear as this bear is walking close. I was like, do we stand now? Do we stand now? When do we stand?
So I wasn't that tough. This camera was like the size of this room though, I mean, it's huge. It's so scary.
Useful news you can use. Over here.
Very good. So thank you. I thought that was informative and engaging. And it was also curiously uplifting. I don't know how you managed to do that, even though you were saying all these things about how bad things are. I think there's some kind of catharsis going on
I
here.
just modulate my
Just
voice a
saying
lot.
it. So I want to ask about the role of the media. Because I mean, it seems to me the Biden administration would not be doing what they're doing if they were expecting a very different reaction from the mainstream media. And I guess what I'm wondering is, you know, are the media sort of committed to a certain type of spin so that, you know, if the Biden administration wants to spend more and there's not enough money, they will definitely spin it as Republicans want to cut retirement benefits, or they don't want to spend enough on education or whatever, or are they committed to the Democratic Party so that whatever the Democrats want to do, that's going to be supported, you know, by the media?
It's been the biggest change I've ever seen, and it just shocked me. I mean, we were talking about institutions and problems with failed institutions. This is one of them, and it's really is shocking to me because, you know, I used to get asked a long time ago, like, to talk about media bias and everything, and I always said, and I believed it firmly. I said, you know, I worked on the news side of the Wall Street Journal for a number of years before I ended up at the editorial page. I know a lot of people who work in news organizations, and I used to say all the time, I was like, you know, it's not like I could count on one hand the number of people who I feel get up and they like, we're going to take it to conservatives, you know, today, use the power of our pen. That's how I used to be. And I would always sort of argue, it's just more the problem, like everybody went to the same schools together. They all have this, they all live in the same neighborhood, and they're all kind of left to center, and they've literally never met like anyone who thinks like me. Yeah, or a bear. You know, they think supermarkets grow their groceries and stuff like that. Like, so that's just like the way they think, right? And so it wasn't deliberate. It was just, you know, I remember sitting on a media panel once with a senior editor at the Washington Post, and I made this argument. And I said, you know, a good example is like whenever the press writes an article, this was when George W. Bush was in office, like whenever they write an article about some sort of reform that an environmental agency has done under George W. Bush, like the headline always says, you know, George W. Bush rolls back critical environmental protection, you know, because they've literally never lived in a rural community. They have like no idea how stupid many of these rules are. And I got asked this question, and I said this in the Washington Post, and the person was asked by the moderator, he's like, well, what do you say to that? And he just looked at me and he goes, but it is really bad every time you roll back an environmental rule. And the moderator was like, I think you're making her point. But that has changed, okay? Something profoundly bad has changed. Donald Trump gave the media the excuse it long wanted to become overtly partisan. And I fundamentally believe that much of the media, not all, I think there's still some really good reporting in newspapers and out there, but for the most part, much of the media now operates as an arm of one political party, rather than what they needed to be doing. And to the institution point, I truly believe that we wouldn't have the insane politics we had today if the media was acting in its old role of serving as a kind of guardrail against excessive behavior on either side. Instead, they only want to talk about one side, but in doing so, they're allowing the other side to bust all the guardrails. And that's leading to that lowering of the bar again and again and again. And I don't know how you fix it. Because the other thing too, there's also a financial element to this too. We also, you know, when newspapers and online and cable companies, when they lost advertising revenue, like kind of their traditional form of making money, and had to rely on subscriptions and clicks, there is an incentive, a built incentive for people to run the most radical things that they can over and over again. And that
it doesn't fit at all with the role of chiding people for not behaving, you know? They want people to misbehave because then they can write another story about it and get another subscriber.
Go here, and then a lot of questions, then here, and then we'll go over there. Go ahead.
So forgive me because I'm also sort of a pox on both of their houses
Yeah.
kind of gal, and I'm gonna sort of go into that direction because I feel like so much of this problem that we're talking about right now in regards to the Biden presidency and the catastrophe that has been and the sort of horrifying state of our politics comes down in some sense to the fact that there isn't like a credible Republican Party that could really go out and win a 60% election, right? You know, I mean, maybe Nikki Haley could do that. She seems fantastic. She seems, you know, there are polls that say that she's beating Biden by 10 points in potential head-to-head matchups, right? That sounds fantastic. I would love to live in that country, but it seems like the way that the Republican Party sort of got deformed during the Trump era, right, in particular, has really, and some of these things started to happen in the Obama era, right? You mentioned the DACA thing, which is of course like one of the worst things that any president has ever done, because Obama was the first guy to say, I think this is unconstitutional, but I'm gonna do it anyway.
Well, why not?
Right? But then, you know, under Donald Trump, the Republican Congresses spent $5 trillion.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I know.
Spent $5 trillion,
Appalling.
right? So why do we have inflation? I mean, yes, Joe Biden also spent trillions of dollars, but it certainly started with
Oh,
the
yeah,
Republican
absolutely.
Congress is spending $5 trillion. So how do we even begin to think about fixing our politics when, you know, the best that Nikki Haley can do is 19% in New Hampshire to
Yeah.
Trump's 49%, right?
So I think, by the way, I mean, look.
Not Nikki Haley herself,
Yeah, I
right, but
understand.
a credible
Yeah, I
next
understand.
generation leader.
So, yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. And by the way, yeah, I mean, no one has written more columns like bashing on Republicans for their spending habits. I mean, they're horrible, absolutely horrible. And I was so happy to see Nikki Haley in that first debate being like the Republicans are bad as the Democrats on spending. I mean, look, there was Republicans in the Senate. That omnibus last year was one of the grossest products that had ever come out of Congress, and they were all for it. And that's got to change. So on the primary, and this gets to the whole, I still think there's a very good chance Donald Trump is not the nominee.
Just let the shem from your lips to
And
God's ears.
so look, I mean, here's one thing. Everyone now up front is aware of how he did it last time, right? He divided and conquered, right? So nobody would get out, and he never had more than 35% of the vote. And but you know, Ted Cruz and John Kasich decided to engage in a death match until the bitter end, and they split the rest of the vote. Everyone understands that. So first of all, a lot of people forget this. In 2016, there were 18 Republican candidates on stage. You know, we're starting at a much lower number. Donors understand this, and I can promise you that if they're getting closer to Iowa and their guy is still polling 4 or 5%, there is gonna be no more money. Like, it's gonna be enormous pressure to get out and to make this a one-on-one race. There's a big belief out there in the Republican Party that if you can get someone who beats Trump in Iowa, then it's actually more likely than not that he loses the nomination. Whereas if he rolls over everybody in Iowa, then it becomes kind of difficult, you know, to stop the steam train. So, but the point is the
And he
fact that
lost
I
Iowa
can say
last
this,
time.
everybody knows that, right? Like, it's just different this time. Nobody kind of understood what was happening the last time around until it had already happened and it was too late. People are very, very aware this time. Now, I mean, are there going to be some people from ego and stuff that are going to be hard to get them to go? Yeah, but I think there's going to be a lot of effort this time.
I hope so.
Well, I mean, I'm not, I don't endorse, I don't, you know, I'm
Yeah.
just stating the dynamics.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go here. When you guys, one of you two can do rock, scissors, paper.
Okay.
You both raise your hand at the same time.
I'm curious how you responded, and would you put it into a partisan attack when a couple of days ago, and you talked about how you've been following all that's happening
Yeah.
very recently, when they published General Kelly's views, attesting to the article in the Atlantic magazine some time ago, that those, I would say, horrid comments that Trump had made, that is the basis for a lot of people's resistance to him from a cultural perspective is more than just politics, economics. Was that a kind of legitimate reporting in your view? Was it a hatchet job? Should it not have been out there because it was put in maybe not a conservative press? I'm very honestly concerned with your reaction. I'm curious of my reaction.
I mean, look, I think if people are willing to talk, and they have, reporting, get it out there. I mean, I don't think what was your concern?
That's all your view is, that it was just reporting. There was no impact. It wasn't a serious article to be taken in consideration when considering candidates.
When considering candidates, I mean, sure, except for I kind of honestly also feel at this point that there is nothing more that can be said for or against Donald Trump, right? I mean, did anyone actually read that and be like, wow, that surprised me?
I think that's part of my issue. I believe, yes.
Really?
Absolutely. I believe the 30 to 35% of the country that are a bit blind to that actually don't usually read or pay attention to that. So my reaction was, it didn't change my view, but I said that this is powerful and perhaps more people will pay attention to this. That's why I asked you if you view that as a legitimate or a partisan hatchet job.
I mean, look, there are a lot of partisan hatchet jobs these days, right? And do I wish they weren't the case? Absolutely. I think that this is unfortunately become another aspect of sort of our politics, is that if you look at, it's quite remarkable. If you look at what an average campaign spends, the percentage of it that actually goes to undermining and trashing your opponents and planting stories as oppo research. By the way, that's not new. Probably everybody knows the famous story about Lyndon Johnson, saying that his press guy said, that they were going to, he'd heard that he instructed a press guy to go out there and plant a story that his opponent had been fornicating with a goat. And the press person said, but that's not true. And he said, I know, but I want to see him deny it. So, it's not new. Sorry. Is this all being taped and things?
Yeah.
Probably.
Stream.
Stream. Anyway, I used a nice word. So, I did.
So if your kids are watching.
Yes, if your kids but
Not
anyway.
like her mom.
So,
Not gonna like her mom.
I'm better than my mom. Yeah. So do I wish it didn't happen? Yeah, but it happens all the time.
Which didn't happen, his words or the publication?
Hatchet jobs. Yeah. Look, the thing that makes me more worried, is when people are breaking the law to do it. So, for instance, we just got an indictment of this guy who leaked all the proprietary tax records to two newspapers. And by the way, ProPublica, when they published that tax information with millionaires' tax records, they weren't doing that in any noble spirit. They were doing it to coincide with the campaign that was being waged by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders to raise taxes on wealthy people. Okay. Or by the way, let's talk about the entire record and body of evidence that turned out to be incorrect. That was called the Russia collusion reporting. And by the way, you know that happened because reporters broke their fundamental rule. The press is the only industry that I know of that actually has its own shout out in the Constitution. And one of its jobs as acting as a fourth estate is to be skeptical always of government. And instead, all of that reporting was being dictated by government officials who were lying to reporters, by the way.
You're comparing the example of the article I mentioned to you to the earlier reporting about the misrepresentation of Democratic act.
I was just giving examples.
No,
I was
what-
just giving examples
Let's
of
move on.
other
We've got-
reporting.
thank you.
Yeah.
We've got a question up there. Thank you.
I went to our Boulder Valley School District debate last night,
Good.
and there were 10 candidates. There was only one who was different than the other 9. And all the questions broke entirely, 100% along cultural lines. So And I actually also ran for the state assembly and knocked on thousands of doors and talked to, I don't know, 1,000 people. And in the end, the thing that pushes people on who they're going to vote for are cultural matters. So and then you roll that in with how atomized we are as voters. We curate our own news. Elon Musk made a comment today about who reads legacy news when 3 days ago you read it on Twitter. That's me. I mean, I'm going all over the internet looking for the big issues of the day. And yeah, inflation is painful, but people are really angry about the cultural divide. I mean, that is what is animating people. And to think that there could be a Reagan that could mandate over these two gigantic groups.
So, but let me
Well,
just.
I just think, I mean, and more to the point, I just want to put out there that Ron DeSantis, who a lot of people think could, you know, part the Red Sea and bring everybody together because he's rational and he's younger and he's not half dead and he doesn't have indictments against him. The fact of the matter is he has been deep, you know, vilified by this cultural war as a very hard right leader. And to think that he's gonna get all these neutral people when push comes to shove, they are voting on cultural matters. There were women who agreed with me on every single thing until it came to the matter of abortion. And because in our city, the biggest problem we have right now is drugs and crime. And everybody agreed. And that's all I cared about when I was running. But when the minute they asked me about abortion, I just was like, no, I'll see you later. They weren't gonna vote for me. So I really don't know. I don't know that this is fixable.
So by the way, but I think that's an absolutely perfect place to have a discussion. I'm not saying that no politician should ever discuss cultural issues. I'm just saying that if they're going to be dealt with, it absolutely should be dealt with in local communities and at a state level. In states where traditionally, under the Constitution, those kind of decisions, for instance, about abortion, about sexual crime, are handled at the state level. I'm just saying that to have national politicians running around saying, I'm going to fix this and impose my view of this on all 50 states, that is essentially, that is not a small government position.
No, but I guess all I wanted to say was they all sat down and agreed the problem in Boulder Valley is declining enrollment. It never occurred to 9 of the people that the reason the enrollment is declining is some people hate the schools and they hate the cultural revolution that has happened in the school. And then all of the questions were on the culture. That's what I'm saying. It's like you try to come at it different ways and it strips down to that. And the divide is getting bigger, not smaller. And I don't see a way out.
Take one last question here, so.
I really appreciate
We're at it.
what you were saying
Trying to give
about
the students a chance there.
being involved in, on the local level and state level, and you're talking about attending local school board meetings and state assemblies. Could you expand more on some other things that we could get involved in?
Oh, sure. First of all, there's things like, going to those obvious things like your board meetings, school board meetings, okay, your city council meetings, being involved and actively engaging with your, giving feedback to, for instance, your state assembly member and your state senator. But, a lot of communities, especially if they're a bigger size, not so much in Alaska, okay, like we got nothing. But, in states like this, there are often a lot of like quasi commissions, by the way, that members of the public sit on, that are involved in sort of zoning questions or arts and education issues, where you can be involved in that. And they often have hearings as well, too. You can give feedback to state agencies, especially about rules that you don't like, or rules that aren't working, or comment periods that are going on for rules that have been proposed at the state level, or, sometimes the state congresses will have field hearings. You can attend those and sort of provide feedback. There's a lot you can do at the local level.
Do they, where is this information compiled? Is there a place where
You
we can
have
go
to kind of go, if you go, for instance, like here in Boulder, if you just went and looked up, if you wanted to start at like the city level, right? Just go to the City of Boulder website and start to sort of work your way through the different pieces and agencies that exist out there. See which ones have board meetings, see which ones have elections, see which ones, solicit public input. Like, I mean, I think that's like a really, like a lot of people, I mean, I'm sad to say probably not people in this room, but many, many, many people in the world have literally never been to a city hall meeting, you know?
And if you're a student, you can sign up for the student rate for the Wall Street Journal.
That's
And
right.
you can go every week.